All right. Hey, folks, it's Faz from Fazlifts. I am back. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about what I eat for hypertrophy and good health and how you can determine what's best for you. But firstly, where have I been? So, for the observant of you'll know that I've been away from YouTube for about 2 weeks. And I was away on holiday in Bulgaria. Lovely place, very nice people, definitely recommend it. However, I ended up getting quite ill over there. I was down with a case of food poisoning, which is fine. The actual food poisoning itself wasn't the big problem, but the food poisoning left me with a throat infection, which then meant I massively overheated. I was dehydrated. It was an absolute mess. Luckily for me, the hotel that I was staying at had a doctor on site, and he was really good. He was very kind, very knowledgeable. He managed to get me on an IV drip because my body temperature had gotten so high. I was unable to cool myself. So body temperature got up to 39.8, which is just verging on where things start to go really wrong. And at that point, the body can't really cool itself properly. So you end up, your body does weird things like it ends up shivering to get blood flow around, and it was just a mess. In any case, had to have a total of 3 IV drips over the course of the week. Temperature finally came down, throat felt like swallowing glass, just about feeling better now. Lost something like 6 or 7 kilos of weight relative to when I was away. It was just a mess. Not to be too dramatic, but I honestly feel like that doctor either saved my life or prevented some real bad stuff from happening, because if I hadn't managed to get my body temperature down, it would have just carried on skyrocketing upwards and spiraling upwards because it gets out of control, and it would have been really bad. But thankfully, all okay now. Everything's fine, and throat infection's pretty much gone, and I'm back to it. So that's where I've been. So thank you for being patient. Don't worry about me though. I'm all fine. Everything's all good. I'm still all in one piece. All right. My brain is as intact as it always has been. So we're going to get on with the video, and that is me talking about what I eat for hypertrophy. So let's start with the slides. Right. Now, first thing I want to say is the way to use this video is not to use it as a guide for what you should do. Like, I'm going to explain a few things about my experimentations with my diet over the last couple of years and what I feel best on right now. I'm not trying to sell you that diet. I think those videos where you have people sat there saying this is what you should eat, and they give very specific macro and food guidelines, are probably some of the worst kinds of videos. I think it behooves you to go in and explore what works best for you. And that's going to be a theme in this video. As I explain what I do, I'm going to be encouraging you to look at how you can determine what's best for you. That's really the best type of thing I can give you, the best gift I can give you. And I think it's useful to try and determine what's good for you, because what is best for us right now is often the result of like our biology and our preferences, but it's also the direct result of things we have been doing in the previous past. I'll give you an example. Let's say a guy has managed to get himself really overweight and he's 300 pounds, 400 pounds, and he goes on a low carb, keto, carnivore type of diet. He's probably going to feel great. He's probably going to think that's the best thing ever, because he'll see an immediate drop in blood sugar. He'll see an immediate drop in weight. It'll probably be quite motivational. If he manages to get into ketosis, his appetite will go down, so that will help him stick to things long term, and he can probably stick to things for a good while, maybe 100 pounds, maybe 150 pounds. Then he'll probably think this is the best thing ever. Where people go wrong oftentimes is they don't often realize that what's best for them now is not only the result of what's best for their biology, but also what they have been doing as a response to what they're currently doing. And that will then change, because if we acknowledge that, we have to acknowledge that, well, like the old saying goes, you never step in the same river twice. So if you've made a change based on one particular dietary method and it's stopped working, you might need to change it again, and it might not be the best thing forever. So I think it behooves everyone to constantly be evaluating how they feel, how they perform, and also some key biomarkers. And you should do that constantly, because it's very easy to get stuck into a trap of identifying with a diet which has worked for you in the past, but is no longer working for you. And that's when you need to be intelligent, understand when that diet has had its day, and move on to other things. And there's been lots of good examples recently of people doing that. What's the guy's name? Saladino. Paul Saladino, I think it is. Very vocal carnivore advocate, has recently, he's been shouting and canvassing for all meat diet for years, and which I have always said it is quite dangerous. And recently he's broken away from that, and now he's eating fruit and he's encouraging people to do that. It's just interesting when there's a lot of people having these realizations, and they're all starting to go back on some of the fairly crazy things they were saying before, like fruit is bad for you and stuff like that. So I think he's done that. Mark Bell has done that as well. Also, for those of you who watch his channel, Thomas DeLauer, he's also been doing something similar, talking more about carbs and things too. So it's just interesting. A lot of people from that side of the community are moving more into sort of carbs now. But in any case, and it's probably no coincidence, they've probably gotten quite lean, quite healthy doing the other stuff, so now they can reincorporate things, which is just an example of what I'm saying. Anyway, going on to the first proper slide. So firstly, macros. Now, in terms of my diet right now, you can classify my diet in terms of macros as being low fat, moderate to low protein, and higher carbs. That seems to work best for me. I definitely like having a lot of carbs in my diet, and that makes me feel good. It generally makes my biomarkers respond pretty well too, like resting heart rate, blood pressure, blood glucose, and also blood work when I do it every few months as well, twice a year. So that tends to have the best effect for me, is high carbs, and conversely, low fat tends to work very well. I don't seem to have problems with hormonal production when my fat is low. It doesn't really seem to bother me for whatever reason. As long as I'm having a good degree of whole food carbs, so I'm not talking about sweets and crap like that, but lots of fruit, lots of vegetables, rice as well, quite a lot of, I'm good. I feel good, I perform good, and my biomarkers suggest I'm moving in the right direction. So everything, the way I feel and under the hood, all seem to work in favor. Now, when it comes to low fat, I have done some experiments recently over the last year with having much higher fat intakes and much lower carb intakes, and temporarily it feels quite good. But it's something which has negatively impacted my biomarkers over time, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. But one thing I'll just mention here is protein intake. So even up to recently, a few months ago, I experimented with super high protein intake, something in the region of almost 300 grams. Now, I found that was quite good for glycemic control. But at the same time I was doing the high protein experiment, I was also experimenting with high vegetable intake. So it was high protein, high vegetables. That was very good for glycemic control, made me feel good, very stable. But it didn't really have any positive impact above and beyond just regular caloric intake on my performance or the way I feel in general. So I've since dropped protein super low, some days as low as 80 to 100 grams, like that low, really low. And I've not seen it to have any kind of negative impact on my physique, my health, my performance at all, which I'm not so sure I'm ready to commit to that for my clients, because I'd like to test for longer. But it's certainly interesting for me. It's not something which I would go to as something which would have a big impact on my physique, like lowering protein intake. I've always generally favored higher protein, but when I did that experiment and my protein got quite high, got up to 280 grams, 300 grams, I also wanted to remember doing a podcast on it, and on my podcast. And I remember talking about high frequency, high protein intake and how it was working quite well. So I thought, let's try do the opposite for a while. Let's try lowering the protein intake, but keep the vegetable intake nice and high. And in fact, I can get away with more fruits and vegetables because my protein intake is a lot lower. Seems to have no negative impact on performance at all, or muscle mass, or anything. So it would seem from that short n equals 1 experiment that actually what I was benefiting from was the higher vegetable intake and higher fruit intake rather than the higher protein intake. I've since dropped the protein to a lot lower. It hasn't had any kind of negative impact. If anything, my meals are just more tasty now that I'm able to eat more fruit and more vegetables, and I'm generally more full. It's an interesting one. It seems to call into question quite a lot of what I know about what I thought I knew about high protein intake. That is satiating to a certain point. I seem to get more satiety from high fruits and vegetables intake. Like my fruit intake right now is super high. Like I love it. It's great. My vegetable intake is pretty reasonably high, but I just eat a hell of a lot of fruit. Yeah, so it doesn't seem to make a difference. So macro-wise, in summary, much lower fat, moderate to low protein, and higher carbs seem to be what's best for me. I don't seem to lose anything on performance. I just feel better and better. So happy days. Now, next, I want to talk about where I get my protein sources from. So in general, like I favor the leanest cuts or fatty fish. So I would say you could describe my diet from the point of macros, saying low fat and moderate to low protein, high carb, but also you can categorize my diet as being pretty close to being whole food plant-based. Now, the meaning of that has taken on its own life as a sort of a, when you say whole food plant-based, people assume you're talking about like a healthier vegan diet. I don't have any issues with eating chicken and fish myself, personally. I don't see that as a problem from an ethical standpoint. That's not something that I place a great deal of value on. So when it comes to health, I don't seem to have any negative impact on health from eating chicken, white fish, also some fattier cuts as well, like salmon, sardines, stuff like that. Very nice. Sardines on toast is an old classic that my father used to have when I was a kid, and I remember that a long time ago. But yes, that's a nice combination too. So yeah, in general, I respond well to chicken, fish, and also some fattier fish. So lean fish and some fattier fish. That doesn't seem to have any kind of negative impact on my health that higher dietary fats do, especially from saturated sources like heavier meats or heavy dairy. Stuff like that seems to have much more of a negative impact on my health and my well-being, which I'll explain in a moment because I did experiment on that. But for now, yeah, I would categorize the majority of my diet as whole food plant-based, but I'm not completely vegan at all. Like I'm fine with eating chicken, white fish, and it doesn't seem to have a negative impact on my health. I do minimize those sources because I don't have super high protein right now. I prefer having higher fruits and vegetables. But if I am eating protein, that's generally where it's going to come from. If I am eating more concentrated sources of protein, that's generally where they come from, and that's fine. It doesn't seem to have a negative impact on my health. Things like I avoid when it comes to meat are fattier sources of beef. Doesn't seem to do so well with me. I'm undecided on eggs. And something I'm going to experiment with more. I've not managed to do that yet. It's an experiment that I want to do. In the past, I've also ate lots of eggs on and off, but that's generally been in coincidence with a lot of heavier meats as well, like steaks and things like that. So I can't really decide whether eggs are good or bad for me. I'll have to have a look at that. I remember a while ago, Derek from More Plates, More Dates did an experiment where he looked at the effect of eggs on his blood work, and he found that he was quite an outlier, and actually eggs were very detrimental for his blood work. But oftentimes you don't see that. He seems to be an outlier in that respect, but I've not really yet determined how they work for me. It's something I'll experiment with at some point, but right now I don't really feel any major desire to do that experiment. My diet is fairly consistent. It's quite boring. I eat a lot of the same foods over and over again. But anyway, let's discuss a bit of an experiment I did. So for about 6 months, spanning over 2021 to 2022, at the beginning of this year, I did what was initially a keto experiment, and then it went full on carnivore for a while. And I was fully engrossed in the whole sort of low carb community. It was an interesting experiment looking back at it now. So almost initially, I found some weight, my weight dropped. So I was able to hold about 80 kilos fairly easily, as long as I ate, things like steak, fish, eggs, butter, all that kind of stuff. So from the weight, it was quite a gratifying experience. The actual weight loss was great, and it was quite easy to sustain a low body weight. The thing is, I wasn't overweight at the time. That wasn't as big a draw as, and I also track my biomarkers. So just maintaining a low body weight wasn't really that enticing in and of itself because I was never that fat. But what was an acute and also long-term negative was the impact on some of my biomarkers. And that was more insidious, and it was something which crept up on me over time. So I initially found my blood glucose was great. Like, I was walking around fasted blood glucose was like 3.8, 3.9, like nice and low in the mornings, like really good. Doctor would be pleased. So that was fine. But that was initially the first sort of month or two. I found my blood sugars dropped right down, and I was like, this is pretty cool. Why not? Normally I hang out about 4.2, 4.5, 4.6 after a cheat meal, maybe 5. Generally my glycemic control is pretty good. I have a lot of muscle, so that's pretty normal. But on the keto carnivore, blood sugars came down even further. So I was like, this is good, this is nice. But there was a problem. As I continued to hold on to a low body weight, all my biomarkers started to go in the wrong direction. And I just want to remind people at this point, this is not me telling you guys what you should do. Okay, this is me telling you what I did and how I determined whether a diet was good for me or not. Okay, so if you're sat there and you're a staunch carnivore keto proponent, and a lot of you guys are batshit crazy, so don't get your panties in a twist. All right, calm yourselves down. Go have a slice of bacon or something. But I'm telling you the results of my experiment. So I found that over time my blood sugars started to creep up, and I did some blood work in about February, which was 4 months in the middle of my experiment, towards the end of February, and I found my triglycerides were going up as well. Now that's not good. Okay, so blood sugars were rising, triglycerides were rising, and it wasn't a transient rise up and down like blood sugar measured at home can be quite up and down. It's not like a long-term blood work reading. If you do a finger prick, it can go up and down, but it was like a long-term trend. It was going up, and blood work suggested triglycerides were also on the way up. And I was like, this is not good. And at the same time, my blood pressure was creeping up too. It's like, this is no bueno at all. Now, my blood pressure never got high, but I think it was bordering on 120/80, which for me, it's like, that's too much. Like, you got to bear in mind, I've done a lifetime of lifting. I'm generally pretty healthy, even though I'm 41. So, like, my blood pressure should not be there. Generally, my blood pressure hangs out at about 110/70. That's fine. So it was creeping up to 120/80, and I was like, this is not good. So blood sugars were going up, triglycerides were going up, blood pressure was going up, and this was 6 months on a keto carnivore type of diet. I was like, this ain't good for me. And eventually I broke free from that, and I carried on with my regular diet of mostly whole food, plant-based, 90 to 95% fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. But it took a while for all that to normalize. And I was reflecting on my experience, and I really got involved in the whole low carb community on YouTube, on Facebook, and all that kind of stuff. And I remember thinking that the low carb community as a whole, it does appear to be built on a bedrock of YouTube doctors, like a lot of guys who have got the MD or doctor in front of their name, but they all seem to have a book to sell. And it's all very counter mainstream. And that was the worrying thing for me. Is like, this is all very. I remember watching the Joe Rogan podcast with Chris Kresser, and this other vegan guy, who, to be fair, was a little bit slimy, but he was talking sense. And everything Chris said was very much against the mainstream, and he was poking holes in the mainstream, which is a very easy angle to poke holes against, because it's very easy to blame your doctor or blame medicine for your current condition. Like, I see on Reddit all the time, you get guys who used to be 300 pounds, 400 pounds, because they gluttonize themselves with junk food. They're blaming doctors for saying, well, doctors are always telling us the wrong thing. Like, they're telling us saturated fat is bad. Yeah, they are. They're also telling you to go for a jog and have some fruit and vegetable every day, but you're not doing that. So the low carb community seems to be built on this bedrock of blaming mainstream science, because it's very easy to sell excuses. And people who have been very overweight and have damaged their health love excuses, because no one likes to blame themselves. And I found they were all doing that. They were all appealing to this. We've got to blame someone, not blame you. Let's not blame you for being 300 pounds, 400 pounds. Let's blame your doctor, because apparently your doctor didn't tell you that gluttonizing yourself with 5,000 calories every day isn't a good thing. And apparently you needed to be told that. But that's what they're all built on. And then this reverse engineer from there, all these like weird mechanistic arguments about the body and how it works. And that's all wrong too. Like, it's all counter mainstream. And they pick apart on some of the really weird mechanistic arguments about rising blood sugars, but then they miss out large things to do with rising triglycerides. And so then they have to reverse engineer things and say, actually, cholesterol's not bad or fiber's bad for you. And just like it's like this weird topsy-turvy conspiracy theorist movement. The low-carb community is a conspiracy theorist movement. It's not a dietary movement. It's a conspiracy theorist movement. And it's very telling that during the recent few years, the big P word, a lot of those guys stopped talking about diet and instead they started talking about government intervention, lockdowns, all that kind of stuff. Because it's all built, it's a conspiracy theory movement. And on top of that, there's this whole appeal to masculinity. Eat your meat, eat your steak, blah, blah, blah. We don't want to eat bugs and all that kind of stuff. It's just really weird, like pseudo-masculine stuff. Like, bro, it's food. It's not that serious. Like, who cares if you eat a few beans? It doesn't matter. And no one's saying you don't have to eat chicken and fish and all that stuff. Go ahead. But you should be able to find what works for you. But I just find there's this real appeal to masculinity. And I think the bedrock of where it all comes from, and just to go off on a big sort of tangent here, the bedrock of where this all comes from is that I think a lot of people who are attracted to low-carb community are also attracted to conspiracy theories. And I think they're not unintelligent people, but there are people who lack the ability to process nuance. So it's easier to blame everything on one thing for them because they lack the ability to process nuance. If you trace all low-carb community arguments down, they all revert back to Ansel Keys. That's where it all originates. If you look at any of these low-carb zealots, these doctors on YouTube or on Instagram, it all seems to go back to blaming Ansel Keys for everything. Apparently Ansel Keys did some stuff 60 years ago. We've just been hurtling towards poor health ever since because it's his fault and the government are just shoving junk food down your throat. Never mind personal responsibility. You've got to blame someone, right? So these low carb communities seem to be built on a foundation of conspiracy theorist movements. And if they're not talking about conspiracy theory within the low carb community, they're talking about general political conspiracy theories. And there's a whole smattering of appeal to masculinity, which I personally found really, when I broke out of it, I was like, whoa, this is really messed up. Like, none of the arguments actually make any sense. They're all counter mainstream. They're all appeals to masculinity. All these YouTube doctors have got something to sell. They're all counter mainstream. They're all blaming your doctor. Like, it just doesn't sit right with me. Personal responsibility is like out the window. It doesn't sit right with me. You've just got swarms and swarms of people just blaming the government, blaming their doctors, like for them being 300 pounds or 350 pounds. No, it's your fault. It's not theirs. Nobody told you to gluttonize yourself. Like, it's not. Like, it's yours. So I think that is when I saw that, when it clicked to me, I was like, yeah, this is not right at all. So I couldn't align myself dietary wise with that kind of movement anymore because there was too many gaps. But anyway, that was like my thinking. So that's my experiment with keto and carnivore. Now, moving on. Fruits. I eat a lot of fruit. Big fan of mango. Luckily, around here, I get frozen mango, which is relatively well priced. Mango, bananas, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, all my favorites. Love all that kind of stuff. I've actually got a large bowl of blueberries, strawberries, and bananas defrosting right now in the fridge, in the kitchen. Great, I love it. So I eat a lot of fruits. Now, from what I see, fruits don't seem to have a negative impact on my biomarkers at all. So my heart rate, blood pressure, no impact whatsoever. Glycemic control, if anything, it seems to have a positive impact on my glycemic control, which is really interesting because, again, you have a lot of people out there who blame fruits, say you shouldn't be eating them. So for me personally, and again, this whole video is about finding what works for you. When I eat fruits and stuff, I feel good. I also don't have any issues with my biomarkers. So fruits for me are very beneficial. I judge what I eat based on how it makes me feel, how I perform, muscle growth, and my biomarkers. So with all those factors, fruits are definite yes. It seems to work great. If anything, I'd say I get more from fruits than I do vegetables. So next up is veggies. I'm big on potatoes, love my potatoes, and really all kinds of vegetables. I literally have next to me right now, don't know if you guys can see this, but a plate of oven roasted Brussels sprouts. Literally have that right here, just tossed in salt. Delicious. Okay, great way of getting in some veg. Just about a kilo of Brussels sprouts that I cooked up this morning. just have them next to the desk as a snack. Really good. I try and get as many vegetables as I can. I'm a big fan of carrot and swede. Brussels sprouts are pretty good. Sweet corn, peas, stuff like that. All very good. Like, big fan of vegetables. And if anything, just has a big net positive on my satiety, my performance, my glycemic control, everything really. Okay, next is, and I've lumped these together because I often cook them together. So rice, legumes, beans, and lentils. Most of the time, if you're having a conversation about these things, people generally tend to talk about legumes, beans, and lentils together because they're all part of that family. But I talk about these together just because I generally cook quite a lot of rice and beans, and I'm a huge fan of that. So one of my favorite dishes, like it's a real comfort food, is rice cooked in broth with kidney beans or black beans. Just delicious, like great. You don't even really have to season it particularly much. So if you put in some broth in the rice cooker, it gives it a lovely flavor, maintains its moistness really nice, and then just add some kidney beans on top. It's the one instant where I use just ready-made kidney beans in a can. Generally, if I'm cooking kidney beans on their own, I'll have them from dried kidney beans and make them overnight. But in this case, just add them in at the end. Tastes delicious. Lentil soups, I'm a big fan of. Just beans on their own or with potatoes or with some chicken. Very big fan of that as well. Again, it fits my profile of very low fat, moderate to low protein, high fiber, high carb, just fits great. And in that whole food, plant-based kind of paradigm. But yeah, works really well. Okay, so concluding thoughts. Now, these are the things that I eat from a result of my experimentations with diet over the last couple of years, and they provide me with positive benefits. So the 4 main benefits I look for are satiety. Does it fill me up? That's an important thing. Like, your diet should sustain you. Secondly, performance. Are you able to increase weight in the gym with the style of eating that you have? Do you feel good, and are you able to perform well? They're not always necessarily the same thing. People can feel good. Like, I felt good, pretty good with the low carb stuff. My performance did take a dip though. And thirdly, just feeling good. Like, how do you feel? So do you feel satiated? Do you perform well? And do you just feel generally good on a day-to-day basis? Are you having good poops? Is your stomach health good? All that kind of stuff. For me, feeling good isn't something which I can always rely on because my stomach is always like on point. Like, it's always bomb-proof. There's nothing I can eat. I could eat cardboard and I'd probably be fine. But like, so I have to look for other things like energy levels. Sleep is a very good one for me. And then finally, biomarkers. Things that I track are heart rate, blood pressure, and glycemic control. So my blood glucose in the mornings. All these things, this style of eating makes me feel good. But that's my criteria for determining what feels good. And for you guys, I would just encourage you to just think about that from an unbiased point of view. So try not to be influenced by anything on social media, anything on YouTube, me included, and just figure out what works best for you. But try not to get involved in any of the constant trappings of things like the low carb community, where they have this appeal to masculinity. You know, I mean, the head of the low carb, the carnivore movement is Sean Baker. He basically looks like Clint Eastwood. He's always squinting. He has that. He's always like looking at people with side eye like that, and he's sat there with a massive knife. Like, the whole thing is an appeal to masculinity. Hopefully, you guys see that it's a lot of it is just advertising. That's why he's so popular. And all of these figures, they tend to be very polarizing, which is fine. Like, it's fun for social media, but when it comes to your health, try not to be influenced by that. Just view things from more an objective viewpoint. So satiety, performance, feeling good, and your biomarkers. Yeah, just do your own experiments. It's your health. You don't want to play around with it. Okay, so I am going to call it there. If you like this video, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can also support my work on Patreon. There's a link down at the bottom, or from my website, ebooks, things like that. But for now, thank you so much for tuning in. Just a long, candid talk on my diet and what I do to make me feel good. Hopefully you guys found that stimulating, interesting. So peace out, and I'll speak to you in the next